Welcome. It has just gone 7 p.m. Wednesday the 25th of May, and you are watching episode 49 of Regional Wrap. Regional Wrap, providing an insight of the issues affecting regional Australia and giving a voice to regional residents. My name is Bill Bates, and joining me on this episode, It's the Weather, is my guest Hayden Walker. Hayden is the principal of the longest serving professional weather forecasting company with a history spanning some 130 years and synonymous with names of Australian folklore such as Clement Ragg and Indigo Jones. With a well-proven accuracy record of around 80%, Hayden has become known as Australia's most accurate long-range weather forecaster. He has been successful in predicting many major weather events, such as cyclones Larry, Yasi, Marcia, and Olin, the flooding of the New South Wales coast during the 2015, and the recent storm activity in Queensland and New South Wales. Furthermore, he was the only long-range weather forecaster to predict Cyclone Oswald that brought heavy rains to New South Wales and Queensland, and especially the floods to Bundaberg. Welcome, Hayden.
G'day, Bill. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks. Look, it's a pleasure to have you here. I thank you for your time tonight. I'd like to sort of just start in regards to the history of your weather service, going back into the 1890s and that, with those famous gentlemen from Australian folklore.
All right, then. So Clement Ragg pretty well kicked off the long-range weather forecasting, and he did work for the Bureau of Seasonal Forecasting, or the Bureau, back in those days. And he wanted a protege, of which he got hold of Indigo Jones. He was at the Brisbane Boys Grammar School, and he had a scholarship there, and Clement needed an understudy. So Indigo took observations at the Kangaroo Point in relation to temperatures and rainfall and so forth. And eventually Indigo wanted to set his own observatory up. So his parents, they moved to a place called Cromehurst, which is in Peachester, the Glasshouse Mountains, in 1892. And he formalised the observatory and taking records there, and then finally built a larger observatory whereby he could take records and so forth. So really Clement Ragg kicked it off with the cycles, and then he gave it to Indigo to carry on, and then obviously my father Lennox, and then myself. So there's many years of data in relation to observations. There's many years of sunspot activity, whereby that's what we do. We'll probably go into that a little bit further, but sunspot activity is the main cause of the weather conditions, and Indigo certainly utilised that, and also Lennox over the years. I mean, both men lived off the sun to produce their forecasts. So that's a bit of the history, whereby Clement Ragg was in Brisbane. He ventured around the place in relation to setting all the, all the observations up through Queensland to get Stevenson screens on the go. So setting all the observations to get records and so forth. And then he wanted the understudy of Indigo Jones, and then Indigo kicked it off, and he mainly did it for the rural side of things. And then Lennox took it over, and he just kept going with the rural, and also started to stream into the business side of things as well.
One of the things is, over that 130 years, obviously technology has improved, and there's a lot more information about, and you've got access to a lot more computer data and images, from different weather bureaus, satellites, and that. In regards to long-range forecasting, what has been the mainstay from the beginning that's still here in the present that you use?
Well, it's the observation of the sunspots. I mean, both predecessors, Indigo and Lennox, all they had was charts and a small telescope to observe the sun, which had a filter on it so it didn't hurt their eyes, obviously. But that's all they had was charts and a telescope to view the sun each day when it wasn't overcast, and they both lived off the sun and made their predictions accordingly. Nowadays, it's very accessible via computer. You can get photographs of sunspot activity and so forth through different websites, in relation from the satellites and so forth. So it's much of a muchness, same principles apply.
In regards to the other phenomena, the atmospheric and ocean phenomena, how much do you take that in account when it's sort of, all right, you've got the suns going on, but you also know that different phenomena are in at different stages, and how do they sort of mesh in with that observation?
Well, you need warmer temperatures to certainly have rainfall and so forth, but really when the sun heats up, we heat up, so to speak. So when the sun sneezes, we react. So if we're getting into the sun side of things, we're looking at sunspots or sunspot activity, which is on the sun, and these sunspots can be anything up to 600,000 kilometers in diameter. Absolutely huge, massive outbreaks. So the sunspots, they erupt and then they emit solar radiation or a magnetic field, which goes into a solar wind. The solar wind heads towards Earth, wraps itself round and drops the barometric pressure, or the magnetic reacts with the Earth's magnetic field. And hence, if you have a low sitting on the coast of Queensland and you have a massive sunspot outbreak, that solar wind will fuel that low pressure system, make it develop into a category 3 to 5 cyclone, and then away it goes. But if the sun's dormant, you'll get drought conditions. So what I'm saying is whatever's happening on that sun surface dictates our weather.
So in regards to the difference between weather and climate, how do you fit the whole picture together? Or do you just ignore, with your predictions, just ignore what the past is doing? You just stick to what's happening today and what's likely to happen with the sunspot activity into the next 12 months or whatever.
So we go one step further. So I believe, and predecessors believe, the business, that the weather is cyclical. And it's cyclical because it's based on the 4 major planets. So therefore, that's when you start getting into your cycles in relation to the weather forecasting. And that can vary from 11 to 165 years, depending on their cycle. So if I'm saying for next year that there's heavy rains in April for 2023, I'll be looking very closely at the sunspot activity coming up to April, because I've already used the cycle. So I'm going out in relation to, based on the cycle, I've got heavy rain. There's my 12-month forecast out. Heavy rains for the coastal districts of Queensland and New South Wales. And therefore, the month before, I'm monitoring the sun. And when I start to see those outbreaks of sunspot activity, I know we're on. And that's what happens.
But what you do can be applied by someone else in some other area of the world for their location.
Correct.
So
it's not just, as long as you have the records, Bill. As long as you have the records, you can forecast the weather.
So is there a sort of an association or organisation of long-range forecasters that actually talk or meet or confer? Or you're all just a group of individuals doing your own thing?
I'd probably put it to the latter, group of individuals doing your own thing. I mean, I can get into that, but yeah, extraordinary. Like, I suppose it's a bit of a, what should I say, a bit of a dog environment. It wants to be the best. But look, I view it this way, Bill. I mean, we're continually researching all the time, trying to improve the accuracy of weather forecasting, getting up to that, 90%. I mean, some years are tremendous. Some years you coast along and it's great for you, but other years make it difficult. And other years are difficult, like when you say you have a certain area and you have on your monthly figures for a certain area, it might be between 10 and 80 millimeters. So therefore you have to make a call. So it's varying rainfall. It's not good general rains. Like, I mean, say it was out west or something at 80 mil, because 80 mil is pretty good out west. But, if it was on the coast, if you had 200-300 mil and you only had, say, 40, 50, 120, well, it's a variation. It depends on the cycle and how strong that actual cycle is. So that's where the forecasting gets very complicated. And then you have to start using your grey matter.
But the other thing is too, like I say, 100 mils along the coast is no big deal, but 100 mils inland is a big deal in regards to what you can grow and what you can plant and all those sort of things. So it's there's a relationship between the location and its needs and and what it doesn't want as well. So like I say, I'm up in Cairns. So what? We get 2,000 mils of rain every year, and you, and like, well, it's just water off a duck's back sort of thing. But we do get a little bit cross and upset when we don't get it when we expect it, and there's a bit of lag in the storage of Copperload Dam, and we get a bit worried that we're running out. If those early wet season rains don't come, we get a little bit. Well, the council gets a little bit uptight and runs in water restrictions pretty quick. But it beggars belief, an area with 2,000 millimetres of rain can be worried about its water security.
That's right. Yeah, very true.
So can you give us an idea who uses your services?
Well, obviously, many walks of life, from the bride to be through to industrial, commercial users, businesses, air conditioning companies, insurance companies. They want to know exactly what's going on for the year ahead to work out what the premiums are going to be and how much they need to insure themselves, even from the big guys overseas. So it's a mix of obviously the rural, which comes down to grazing, comes down to cropping. So there's numerous people. There's even like the lobster farmers in rain. There's so many different walks of life that require long-range weather forecasts.
So I suppose to get people to pay for your service, you've got to A, have a reputation, and B, have a degree of accuracy. And also, I suppose you need some sort of disclaimer as well, or tolerance. But do you have many challenges in regards to people getting upset or that with if your forecast was out by this amount of percent or whatever, or out of area or something?
Well, that's true, because what I do with my forecasts, I put them in categories via a legend. So therefore, trying to forecast the weather to the millimetre is not going to work. We'll just forget that. So it's either going to be heavy, it's going to be good, it's going to be reasonably good, moderate, light, or dry. So I have categories in my forecast so that people can say, yep, okay, there's so many millimetres, or there's 2 to 3 inches accordingly. That's fine. But when you start trying to pinpoint to millimetres and say, look, we're going to get 25 mil, look, that's a big call, because the atmospheric conditions can change so quickly, and therefore it may go to 50 mil or might drop back to 10 mil. So, it's a very grey, not a grey area, but it's a very risky area, I should say, whereby you need to be on the ball in relation to what you're forecasting and what you're predicting accordingly. Then that's how it goes, and that's in that respect with my forecasts. Other times, I mean, in the past, I've had a couple of graziers, a couple of graziers, whereby they said, you said there's going to be heavy rain. I said, just wait, the end of the month's not here yet. And sure enough, it was lucky for me that the rain did turn up, and they got both barrels, because it was 2019 up in the Carpentaria, whereby the rain was slow coming, but eventually it turned up the end of January, beginning of February, and it was a double whammy. So the two on the cusp, the rain turned up on the cusp of both months. So I believe in this game, you have to be very patient, and you cannot, what should I say? You should not start getting concerned too quickly, because it does turn up.
You just mentioned the 2019 event up near the Cape, well, it was the Gulf of Carpentaria. That's when we had huge stock losses in sort of the Gulf country, places like Cloncurry and way down to sort of Richmond, and that was a huge huge event, and it still sort of beggars belief how we do get caught with these things in regards to, all right, if you looked at some of those pictures of those floods and the cattle that died, it is somewhat distressing seeing maybe hundreds of cattle banked up against the corner of a field drown. You would hope there'd be lessons learned from that, hopefully, to sort of at least get some high ground in those paddocks, or at least have some way of sort of having enough notice or pre-warning to get your cattle away from those fence lines where they're trapped.
Yeah, that's true. It's certainly gut-wrenching. And the fact of the matter is, look, with any rainfall that's happened, any events in the past, obviously we have a drought, and the rain comes along to break the drought. Heavy rain comes along, floods break a drought. But at the same time, I mean, it happens so quickly, and it's very difficult in relation to trying to move stock and so forth, under those circumstances, because it just go like that. But like I know my forecast was out a lot of the time for the 2019 for the floods, so I certainly gave them the heads up. My clients anyway certainly gave them the heads up, and it was also out in the media as well.
Yeah, I think one of the other problems too, because I've been up in Cairns for about 12 years, and I'm sort of a frequent visitor to the weather radars and stuff like that. And I just find the gap between sort of Cairns, Townsville and Mount Isa is a little bit sort of a worry in regards to we don't have more weather radars out there to sort of give better indications, because I think you won't get a lot of notice, but at least it's something being sort of caught totally by surprise.
Yes. I put the forecast out in the last couple of months on Facebook saying that there'd be, heavy conditions once again, flooding out in the Darling Downs and Maranoa, and also be flooding in Tasmania. So I do put them out on Facebook when they do raise their head. Also, all these floods this year and so forth have been on the Sunshine Coast News media. So that's all backed up in relation to what I've said this year. So that's why people get forecasts from me, so they can plan and prepare ahead, so they know exactly what's going on.
In your game, do you think it's helpful that people have got short memories? Because I'm just surprised by people even my age and that the short memories they got. Like when I was a kid, I remember in Perth in about '63, it was it was one of the worst hot spells we ever had. But that sort of like people have forgotten what things were in the past. Do you think the short memory of people helps you?
The situation is that when you go through a drought, people think it's never going to rain again. They get accustomed to it. And next thing, like when you're scrolling over records myself, next thing with a click of a finger, it'll change. So we become a bit complacent. I think the word's complacent. People become very complacent in relation to, we're going through a drought, it's never going to rain again, so therefore we're not so concerned. And next thing, the flood rains turn up and everyone goes, goodness gracious me, get a load of this. You know what I mean? Like, this hasn't happened before.
Unprecedented.
There you go, unprecedented. Yeah, right. Unprecedented, Bill. That's the one.
Got to get it in.
Oh, goodness me. Yeah, unprecedented. I mean, things have changed too. I mean, like back in the flood rains of years gone by, when the colony first settled, there were flood rains. The Hawkesbury rose 25 feet in 1 year. Another year it rose 70 feet. Another year in the early 1800s. Birds were dropping out of trees. It was so hot. There's so many conditions that they had to put up with when they first arrived. And, what comes around goes around. And that's the simple fact of it all. But what's also changed is the hydrology, is in relation to the hydrology, in relation to, there's been a loss of vegetation, there's been increase in roadways, increase in footpaths, no tanks for tank water. You'd imagine the square meterage of roof areas on a floodplain of Brisbane and Sydney, the Hawkesbury. Imagine how many square meters. So that's all has to go somewhere. And if you've got a high tide, hello, what do you expect?
One of the things about this year's rains that I think it was back maybe when Debbie was on, that was another big rain event. And even going back to the Brisbane flooding of about 2011. One of the things about downgraded tropical cyclones and that is when they got coming through the north, and they seem to come in at a hell of a pace, and then they sort of move inland fairly quickly and dump a heap of rain in North Queensland and that. But these ones that are tracked further south and depleted into a tropical storm, they seem to have been going slower and just persistently giving rain in one area for longer. Is that the case of some of the flooding, like in the past, I think a couple of years ago in Bundaberg, and again earlier this year, that some of those fronts didn't move at what you would say would normally expect those fronts to move through at?
Yeah, they were very strong and very, I suppose, in diameter. They were certainly wide. So therefore, it's much slower for them to move on, because they're picking up they're grabbing all the moisture they can, being large systems. So there's so much acker on the ground that they're slowly grabbing all that and lifting it, and they're just slowly swirling around and just, I suppose, having a feeding frenzy off the moisture. So that slows them down. Whereby if the land's been relatively dry and so forth, you see that they move a little bit different. So as I say, each year is different depending on what is happening with that sun on our cycles and going back into our records.
The difference between a period of drought and then floods, I mean, droughts usually take a long time to come into being, and then they linger, and then people get worried about where they're going to get their next drop of water come from. But so there's a reasonable time scale for people to either try to do something or leave the area or cart water or whatever they've got to do. But with floods, it's a completely different situation. It can be like happy-go-lucky days, and all of a sudden you're sitting on your rooftop. So obviously floods would have to be a more devastating sudden impact than droughts, and more. You probably want more forewarning of those events rather than droughts. Do you think we have been caught short, because we have a history of floods that even in this day and age, we continually to have the same damage over and over again to the same locations? Are we slow learners, or is the weather just getting that bad?
Well, there's two walks of life. You've got the graziers out west, and obviously the agriculture in relation to the component of a drought. So it's gut wrenching having to, for them having to shoot their stock. So that's one side of the equation. The other side of the equation is, obviously the other side of the coin in relation to the flood areas. So that's gut wrenching again, seeing people, lose everything from a flood. But at the same time, as I was saying, just touching base on before, the circumstances have changed. Like the loss of vegetation, as I said, in the roof areas, and I mean, you imagine all that water coming off the roof, and it hits the roadway, and it hits the drains, and then it goes into big drainage channels, and then you've got a high tide. Things are different now in relation to how it affects a certain area compared to years gone by, because that water just cascades down roadways and that sort of thing. So, in relation to what you're asking, should we be better prepared in relation to floods and so forth? I mean, I think there should be like a cyclone rating, 1 to 5. It should be flood levels as well for flooding, with the anticipation that, hey, we're up to category this for a flood. I think that's what should be utilised for the flooding, instead of saying, well, you got to get out now. It's too late. I mean, it's better to be, ahead of the pack than staying there. So I reckon you should have categories in relation to a 1 to 5 when the rain starts. I mean, you can start to see these things forming. You certainly can see them on the weather maps and so forth. You can certainly see that there's going to be a problem. And then you've got to have, I suppose, the big earlobes to make a call to say, I think you better start moving, guys. But then again, on the other side of the fence, you move people out, and next thing it drops off. It didn't happen. So that's what people are frightened of. But I think it's better off to call it.
Yeah,
that's
well,
how I'd see it. I'd call it. I'd certainly call it. I mean, especially what we've seen.
Yeah, especially too. I mean, we've got the example of bushfires. I mean, gee, we've been pretty slow learning about those things too, because years ago people used to stay and stay and stay, and I mean, and it's really only probably in the last 5, 10, 15 years that people are starting to change, and the dialogue from the government and the authorities has really been pushing leave early, leave early sort of thing. So that's one thing that's changed. And I suppose we probably need, as you're saying, we need those categories to help people make a decision to leave early, maybe, and also maybe have a plan to sort of get some of their stuff to higher areas in the house or whatever, and then evacuate.
Yeah.
But it still beggars belief. Here we are this year in Brisbane, the floods again. All right, they didn't peak out at some of the other ones, but we've got this long history. You go back to the floods of, I think, the 1840s, and then the 1890s, and then I think in my time of being a Zoom, I'm West Australian, so I don't know much about Queensland's history or anything like that, but I was aware of the 74 floods, and I've also been obviously aware of the 2011 floods and those sort of things as well. But we have inquiry after inquiry, but we're still going to get caught. It's sort of a bit of a worry.
Well, I'll give you an example. One of my clients, I won't nominate, but they're in Gatton in agriculture. So on my monthly report I produce for them, I have ratings every area throughout Queensland. It's a 1 to 5 rating. So obviously 5 is 200 mil and above. So I have certain narrative I put in there, and yep, sure, they got caught at the beginning of the year. So I also phoned them up and I said, look, I'm just going to let you know, you don't want to hear this, but I'm going to let you know that in May, I have another low that'll sit on the border that may be a problem to you. I'm just giving you the heads up, and it's going to be 5 and above. So these are my reports that go out to people to help them. So, that's what people get them from me for, so they can plan and prepare.
So maybe you can talk about some of the major events that you've forecast, maybe along with others, but the ones that you got out ahead of the game, and what made you twig that those events were coming?
So 2011, I had a radio interview with 4KQ in Brisbane before the floods, the Brisbane floods, and I think it went out in about October the previous year, something like that. I can't recall now, but anyway, it was certainly in advance. And I based that on, like I was saying before, I scroll over records on a daily basis. I look at the sun on a daily basis. And like I was saying before, like I've just had a quick look tonight before our interview in relation to what's coming up for the next 3 or 4 years. So 24 certainly wet, 25 certainly wet. So I'm looking at those rainfall statistics. So when I get I've made the forecast, say for 24, 25. So therefore, when I'm getting closer to the mark, I'm watching the sunspots. I'm watching the sunspots to see how they're traveling in relation to, are they increasing, are they intensifying, or are they dissipating? So that'll cue me in relation to how I'll make my forecast. If I know those sunspots are growing and I know they're starting to intensify, goodness me, look out, because we'll be having, Noah's Ark again. You know what I mean? But that's how I do it. That's the green light for me, because I've made the forecast out in advance, 12 months, whatever, 5 years in advance, whatever the case may be. And then when I start getting closer to the mark, I start watching what the sun does.
But you see, I don't understand. I've been told by people of greatness like Flannery that it's never going to rain again. Our dams are never going to fill. So why should I be listening to you?
Well, the proof of the pudding's with me. You know what happened on the other side?
but you think that don't you think that beggars don't you think it beggars belief that the media and that gives these people such credit, so much coverage and credibility to make sort of statements like that, and it just goes against all common sense. But I'm concerned there, like you're saying, we're going into another couple of wet years.
We will be.
That's sort of starting to be a bit long, like repetitive sort of thing. Are we going to be into the same degree of flooding or likelihood in the same sort of areas, or will they be slightly different?
They'll be the same. They'll be the
So
same.
we
That's
can
the worrying
expect
thing. Look, I don't want to cause public panic or anything like that, but I just tell it how it is. I forecast the weather. If I've got heavy rain, I've got heavy rain, and that's how it is. People have to make their mind up in relation to what they want to do. So in that respect, that's what I've got coming up. I mean, I've already called it that April next year is going to be heavy on the coast of Queensland, the southeast and northern New South Wales. So, it's one of those things. We've had wet years through history. I mean, 1956, the Maitland floods, that was a wet year for many parts of Australia. And 74, it was another wet year. So we've had the wet years. The fact of the matter is, I'm calling it that 24 and 25 are going to be wet. And, and the thing is, where it rains, if it's going to be a wet year, you can bet your bottom dollar it's going to be those areas where the average is high.
The other thing that's obviously would be concerning for our audience is that they've got to get used to having their insurance premium adjusted upwards.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I know. It certainly needs. Look, it's got to be addressed. It has to be addressed. Someone's got to pick the ball up and run with it and sort it out. That's what it boils down to.
Are you still surprised the amount of building approvals and that is allowed in floodplains or continues to go on in floodplains?
Yes.
Especially, we've had an incident, might have been 2019 or whatever, with the floods in Townsville. There's been some new suburbs put in, and of course, a lot of coastal areas very low lying. And one of the features along the coastline is, all right, up here there might only be a major river every so far, but there's a lot of creeks, and they can be fairly substantial in wet weather. And we're seeing suburbs being built with the likely to have propensity to continued flooding and problems as they go as the years continue. And I think in the northern areas of Townsville, they're talking about levees. Do you think it's a bit late to talk about levees after you built the suburbs?
Yeah, probably. But also, it's this here, Bill. It's this here. That's the bottom line. I mean, but look, it needs to be addressed. It really needs to be addressed. It has to be.
But can the councils and all those people in those sort of planning things, they'd obviously have access to a lot of data that would sort of, raise some alarm bells of what they're doing? Or do we need a whole new department or something that can let people know that, don't do this here and don't do that there?
Well, obviously the council have flood maps. So therefore, people, if they're going to build or purchase accordingly, they will obviously have a solicitor and to check out if it's subject to flooding. So, that's the first port of call. But that's the first port of call for people in general to check things out, obviously by their solicitor. But also at the same time, it's, people want to be near the amenities too. That's the thing. They want to be near amenities and close by the shops and so forth, rather than be put somewhere else. So if it's going to be that case, well, therefore they need to address the subdivisions or whatever, in relation to the development of land. They need to either, put a canal system in, so therefore get rid of the water or whatever the case may be, or it has to be filled and have to have deviations. in relation to getting rid of the water, getting rid of it.
With Currumhurst, it was a weather station for a long time, as you say, down through Inigo Jones. Were you somewhat disappointed when that was sort of closed down in 2003?
I think, well, look, it served its time. Let's put it that way. It served its time, and the forestry was at the back of it, and there wasn't any fire breaks. And if someone lit a match, the whole place would have gone up. So, you know, I still have a lot of the records and so forth in relation to database and all that sort of thing. So really it's just a different location. So, you know, you can have a location, you can forecast the weather anywhere, but at the same time, you know, the records went back to 1893, which is a great, you know, records were taken daily all the way through. But then the new owners could have continued with those records.
I'll just have a screenshot. Don't want that. Don't want that. Where's my? Where is it?
1893, the observatory held the record for the most amount of rainfall in a 24-hour period, which is 36 inches overnight. I think that's what you're going to bring up, isn't it?
Yep.
So when you look at the floods we've just had, we've seen, you know, 600-800 millimeters to certain areas, obviously more to others, but that's been for the month, the recent floods we've just had. But 36 inches overnight is colossal.
This is the old.
Yep, that's it.
So it looks a bit weather beaten now.
The old fibro roof, yeah.
Oh, that might actually be asbestos. We might be a bit of trouble there. But this was its record, and it was quite interesting when we had the floods earlier this year in Brisbane. It didn't take too long for Anastasia to get out and have a media conference and call, you know, those weather events and the floods unprecedented. But it's quite interesting how much information is on the internet and how many people are out there to sort of check things. And it would have only been a matter of half an hour or a little bit more before this sort of information showed up on the comments of those stories for the Courier Mail and that. So when these people jump up there and say these sort of things, they've got to be aware that there's people around who can do a bit of checking. But if we go back to the floods of 1893, some of the peaks there were much more substantial than what we've had since. And these are some of the pictures from those floods.
Yeah.
That's probably some people can't relate. That's the old Victoria Bridge. Half of it's gone.
Yes.
But people might know where these sort of things are, you know, through history, like a sign there, Gordon and Gott. So I'm not sure what street that would be in Brisbane.
They were printing, weren't they? There's Milton. Mm-hmm.
And there's Milton. That's just north, upstream a bit from Story Bridge and that. So it's a pretty sad looking site.
Yes.
And of course, everyone's using the punt, but you know, people might have a bit of an idea where that is.
Looks like the valley.
Fortitude.
Mm.
And it was quite easy to catch a steamship because the water came up to came to meet you.
Yep. And here we are. We're going to say, and there's ferries and
look at that. How's that for bad parking of your boat?
That's right.
That must have been a bit of drama getting them back into the water somehow.
That's right. But they were in the botanical gardens, those.
Yeah. So, and there's a sort of devastation in that. So, It's nothing new, and all these people need to be aware when they're making these statements that, gee, today with the internet, there's so much information, so many records, that even Joe Blow can say, well, you're telling a bit of a porky pie there.
Yeah, I know. Look, even if, as I said earlier, even if you look at the statistics when the colony first came about, now the Hawkesbury rose, the highest was 70 feet. The government house got swept away. There were, as I said, birds falling out of trees. They had so many extremes when they first arrived in the late 1700s and early 1800s. And even the big flood in Brisbane and Ipswich, 1841, that was colossal. So what comes around goes around, and that's the basis of it. And the other thing is, it's just not here in Australia, it's all over the world. I mean, in Europe, there was severe storms through London, chimneys, stacks, 2,000 got blown over, 4,000 oak trees got knocked off, 8,000 people lost their lives in Europe, France and so forth. And even you go into history in relation to wars and so forth, wars have been lost based on weather.
Well, I think that was true of Mr. Napoleon, sort of
Correct.
venturing
Correct.
venturing to Russia in the middle of winter. It wasn't a real bright idea.
No, not a good idea, not at all. That's true.
But
yeah, so look,
but even at Waterloo, that was another interesting thing. But the weather had a major effect with that in regards to the British were in position earlier on, and the French were sort of still waiting for Napoleon to get up because no one wanted to disturb his sleep for some reason. And then for them to move into the areas, they were confronted by some fairly hard slogging to get into position. So that was another battle that was influenced by weather. And then, of course, we all know about George Washington and the big freeze that was on there. And that allowed, actually the big freeze allowed Washington to escape the British because it hardened the ground and let him retreat. So the weather does some wonderful things sometimes for some people, but by the same token, it's a harsh master for others.
Very true. Mother Nature unleashes her force. That's right, her fury.
So in regards to the things that people talk about and what's in the newspapers these days about the La Nina and the El Nino and things like that, does your forecasting in regards to looking at the sun also give you a bit of insight how those patterns are going to change as well?
Look, I just base my forecasts, Bill, on the sun, on the sunspot activity and the cycles from the planets. That's what I do, because everything else falls into place after that.
So you don't have to run out there and measure the seawater temperature?
No.
You're not worried about our Great Barrier Reef dying from heat exposure?
It's a seesawing effect. It'll come and go. Yeah. It is based on history.
In regards to Indigo and Clement, how did the changeover go? We know a little bit about the Indigo, but how did your father sort of join the team or add on to that? And of course, obviously, you came after your father, but yes. What was the connection with your dad and Indigo?
So Lennox was a surveyor in the Northern Tablelands. So he surveyed a lot of the roads through Styx River and all those areas. And then he was surveying in the southeast of Queensland. And then there was a job going in relation to Indigo looking for an understudy. So therefore, my father and mother, they made the trek up to Beerwar, and horse and cart went up to the observatory. And there'd been previous people to my father in relation to wanting to take over from Indigo. So Indigo was a very astute man back in those days. And he'd say to these people, can you take over my work? Would you be, you'd be able to do that? Oh yes, no worries at all, Mr. Jones. No problems at all. Right, sacked, gone. So then my father came along, and he had wind of that, and he'd asked my father after being there for a while, and Inigo just said to him, Mr. Walker, can you carry on my weather forecasting? He said, I certainly can, Mr. Jones, but no one will be as good as you. Hired. So that's how my father, because they got on very well, Inigo and Lennox, they got on very well. So yeah, so Inigo, you know, he had certain people there, but they just didn't fit the bill. But also, I think also at the same time, Lennox being a surveyor, he with trigonometry, that certainly helped him to get the job. So besides the fact that, you know, he said to Inigo, you know, no one else can do it as good as you, but the fact of the matter was with my father's trigonometry and surveying, that certainly helped in relation to planets and that sort of thing. And then
in regards to yourself, in regards to yourself, it's probably a natural progression, but did you have an inkling as a boy that you're going to do that, or do you think, or was there other interests that sort of you thought you might have headed off on a tangent?
Yeah, there's other interests, but also at the same time, the only boy, the family, and yeah. So I mean, like I used to spend a lot of time with my father, like over in the observatory. I mean, I loved the old observatory when I was a young kid, going through the old books and the actual smell of the old I suppose building and so forth. It really intrigued me, and intrigued me listening to him having to give speeches and so forth. And yeah, I became very interested in relation to the weather. So I was hanging off his shoulder a lot of the time.
In regards to formal training, like a meteorologist, never struck you to sort of want to hit out that field, or did you do any sort of additional studies?
Yes, I did. The interesting thing is Lennox wanted me, he said, look, I want to keep going with the business, but I want you to go and do something else, completely different to what it is here, because he said, you know, you haven't got tunnel vision. So I went off to, went and did property valuations in a business degree, and might find how does that tie in, but it does tie in because when you're looking at properties, it's like with like. The same thing you do with records. You're looking at like with like, year like with another year. So I did that for a while, and then at Lennox, then I was still there with the weather business, but then Lennox, he said, I'm ready to retire. I said, right then, that's the ball game. Okay, so we made it official, and I took over from Lennox. But you know, I learned a lot of concepts from valuation in relation to like with like.
Now, the move to Bundaberg, when did that happen?
Oh, that would happen in the 2005 or something, 2006, something like that. I thought I'd have a, what's the word? Sea change? Is that the one? Sea change? So I moved
a flood change.
A flood change, exactly.
A floodplain
Isn't it interesting?
change.
Isn't it interesting that Inigo moved to Cromehurst, massive flood of 93, and then Lennox, he moved to Brisbane from Cromehurst. I mean, still had the observatory, but he lived in Brisbane because of the two older sisters who had to go to school and so forth. And the 74 floods came along, and then I've moved to Bundaberg, and then 2011, bang. So the floods have followed us.
Well, Bundaberg's been hit pretty hard in the last few years. I mean, they've had a couple of serious floods there that sort of, and I mean, Bundaberg's got a lot of flat lying ground, and veggie crops in particular. They get pretty well churned up, and we seem to pay the price at the grocery stores and Woolworths and that when Bundaberg's hit. Now living at Bundaberg, do you see sort of things around that, gee, I wish they had a levee there, or I wish they had something else there? Do you take a lot of note of the topography and sort of say, well, gee whiz, we want to be careful in that area or whatever with the Burnett?
Well, one of the main things is the dredging of the mouth. That's one of the main things that needs to be done. So that's the first port of call. And, you know, and then there's obviously, you know, some of the bridges and so forth. And, you know, there's a lot of aqua that comes down from Gain to Mundubra that filters all the way through that catchment area that gets into the Burnett. and comes all the way down from the Clan as well. So it's a big system. It's a huge system. And then there's Paradise Dam. I mean, there needs to be
Paradise Dam.
Paradise
There's a
Dam.
sad saga.
So, you know, that's another thing that needs to be addressed. So, look, there needs to be some money spent, and that's the bottom line. Like all these things, Bill. A lot of, you know, money's the key factor.
Yeah, you mentioned dredging there. I mean, dredging's almost become a dirty word now. Like, to get something dredged, it's like a 2-year application to get something done, and then they might give you a small allowance to do some maintenance dredging or that. How do we wake these people up to say, well, dredging is something you just need to do and just get on with it instead of bloody lock it up in bureaucracy?
I think it comes back to, I think someone needs to be the person out there to suggest these things and get it done. Not just suggest it, but they need to put it in play. I mean, the money that we waste in certain areas is just unbelievable of what we do. I mean, we should have a train system going from Melbourne to Cairns. We should have dual highways from Brisbane to Cairns. I mean, other countries have got it. I mean, we're so far behind the 8 ball, it's not funny. So the money's going into the wrong areas, and they really, I mean, there's other dams that need to be built. I mean, the amount of water that, you know, we are receiving in relation to rainfall and so forth, we need more dams, we need more catchment, we need to pull up that. I mean, like, look at Wivenhoe, and you know, when it gets to a certain percentage, the gates just open. No one presses the button, they open, and that's it. So, you know, there's a lot of things that we can do. I mean, look at all the country up north in relation to, you know, out west in the Carpentaria and coming back into Cairns and so forth. There's so many areas there you can grab some water.
Well, 80% of the mainland water comes from northern Australia, but most of it just flows out to sea. But it's interesting in regards to infrastructure and things like that. And you raise these things aren't happening, but we just had a federal election, and the promises are for childcare, this, that, and other sort of hip pocket things. I suppose we can't really think there's going to be any change to focus on nation building while the politicians and the system runs on a 3-year cycle. And we just want to get in power, and we'll put in policies and spend billions of dollars on childcare or whatever to grab those votes and forget about the nation. Is that what you're alluding to? We're sort of disappointed with the political outcomes that we're getting, but they're probably not going to change.
Well, look, you can still keep those matters at hand that they're supporting, but also, you know, they can work out another way of getting the money to build these dams or infrastructure. I mean, the Bradford scheme back in 46, that would have opened up all the country internally. You know, like, there's all those schemes. I mean, really, the mining companies, they'd be behind it, you know. If there's got to be tax and so forth, another, you know, a bit of a heavier tax, whatever the case may be, they probably won't like it, but, you know, just for a duration of 5 years, just to get this country back to where it should be. You know, there's just so much we've got, but it's not happening.
I was thinking when you mentioned the Bradford scheme, I mean, it was something that got raised back in the 2017 state election and got a bit of a run. But it's like everything, it's just things that get churned over and then put back on the shelf, and there's so many things where they do this economic costing sort of analysis, decide whether it's the cost benefits and things like that. And if it doesn't make that figure that they want, well, they'll can it. They don't look at the long-term implications, because a dam's got to last 200 years. So it's something that's got to be there for a long time, and you can grow into it, sort of thing. But you need to build it now to start nation building types thing.
Yes. Could you imagine if we opened the country up in relation to infrastructure? I mean, how the place would boom. Honestly, I mean, you go over to the States, they get it done like that. They've got a plan, done. They've got it done within a few months, you know, and they excel. It's great. That's another improvement for their country or whatever the case may be. So if we had the same attitude and said, right, let's get onto this, let's prioritize it, let's get into it, let's do the cost benefit analysis. Right, okay, let's do it. Could you imagine the industries of how, you know, how vibrant the place would be? That's how I see it, progress.
But
I'm being too optimistic, am I?
but there's sort of a little bit different mindset in sort of Brisbane and Canberra and that, because we have things up here where people come up with an idea and they only want a bit of a start sort of thing or an approval. Like we want to get some cotton gins into northern Queensland now, because there's been great improvements in the types of cotton that's now available and can be grown in this drier areas. But we still need some water, of course. And we've got things like a lot of local people get involved and sort of make the case. And it seems strange that local people have to make case for something, when really the state government or the federal government should be having all these strategic plans to make sure things happen. You know, it shouldn't take the local community to sort of to drive anything. You would think it would be driven at a much higher level. Let's have a grand plan to get things done, but it doesn't seem to work that way. Local communities have got to raise the issue, find money to put up a business case and all those sort of things. It's us about peak.
Yeah, you've got to fight for existence. That's right, to try and, you know, get it to work, and then it gets knocked on the head. I agree. So
I suppose the other thing is frightening for the government is sometimes the cost of things. Like you talk about the Bradford scheme, you know, that's quite expensive, and would take, you know, of course we've got no money. Everything has to be borrowed now because we've racked up the debt pretty well. But but we can go back in history, and there's visions out there. Like if you go back to the 1890s again in Western Australia with John Forrest and C.Y. O'Connor, you know, they a fledgling colony that just got self-government went out and borrowed £2.5 million. Now, it doesn't sound a lot these days, but that's equivalent to $40 billion today in Australian dollars. So that's a lot of money to stump up for a fledgling colony. But they built 2 dams, 500 kilometres of pipelines, pumping station, and got water to Kalgoorlie. Now, what has been the return from Kalgoorlie over 120 years? It's been phenomenal. Imagine if they had to do a business case to justify that. That's probably why we just don't have those visionaries anymore.
That's the thing. That's it. Vision, pioneers. And the other thing is that, you know, like the money involved, we're too top heavy. We're too top heavy in the government. We're just too top heavy because it doesn't have the legs to get off the ground. You know, it just sits there. And that's the problem. There's just too many departments where, you know, it's got to go to that department. Oh yeah, I'll make a decision in 6 months' time, and we lose business. They go overseas. Simple as that. They go overseas. They don't want to hang around in relation to waiting to see if it's going to get approved or not. So that's another problem. I think you and I, mate, we may as well start it off. We'll sort it out, Bill.
If only people would listen to us. But but we've just gone over the hour, and we're starting to get a little bit off topic. I'd just like to sort of wrap up in regards to what's the message out from you to the general audience about the weather and what we have had and what we will have, And is there that much difference? We need to sort of go and hide in a cave.
Now, look, the situation is we've had these events before, and we'll have the events again. We just need to listen to exactly what's going on, especially like, you know, myself. There's other people out there as well, but I sort of call it how it is. And you just need to look at it. And if I'm calling it, you just be ready, because I don't miss too much. And I've got these, you know, these other couple of years coming up and so forth. So you need to be vigilant and keep an ear open in relation to what's the long term. Because, as I say, what comes around goes around. Based on the sun, Bill.
Oh, that bloody sun! I don't know, bloody. I just don't believe it. It's just a light in the sky.
Tell me, how fast do you think the solar wind travels? How fast do you think the solar wind travels leaving the sun when it hits the Earth? 1,100 kilometres per second. So it only takes a few hours to hit.
And one of the other things that people don't sort of understand too is when there's not a lot of solar wind in that, we actually get a dose of something else, so it's cosmic rays, which is another factor altogether. So, you know, you might be getting a dose of solar wind, but if you're not getting that, you're getting a dose of cosmic rays. So
radiation. That's right. Yeah.
It's all out there. But yeah. No, if we can only just get those climate scientists to sort of have a look up in the sky instead of it in the on the computer screens, we'd be right.
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic. I mean, when you're just talking about the sunspots just then, you know, the Chinese, they used to use smoke to view the sunspots. They used to light a fire, so the smoke would protect their eyes from the sun, so they could look through the smoke at the sun. Unbelievable, isn't it? But yeah, so in the different configurations of those sunspots.
Just before we wind up, so I mean, I used to be involved with ISO charts or whatever they were, IPSO charts, because I was working in the defence and HF comms, and we always had to consult the sunspots radiation things for what frequency we were going to put up, and plan ahead for an exercise or whatever. Being interested in the sun, you would have obviously looked at the sun cycles since they've been first recording and that. And we're now into, I think we're going into 25, is it?
25,
cycle 25. Mm-hmm. And we've just come out of 24, and it was a fairly low. And the indication that this lot of sun cycles isn't going to be that much greater. Do you also find out information in regards to forward predictions for those ISO charts as well? Like, how far ahead can you look to those things that, you know, and like what the sun charts are going to be like in, you know, in this, I think it's 11-year cycle, and is that as far as you can look?
No, look, well, see, the thing is, I base the forecast on the revolutions of the planet, so it can go from 11 to 165. 11-year sunspot cycle averages between 7 and 17, but also at the same time, the 11-year cycle time is very close to the cycle of Jupiter, which is 11.86. And Jupiter is your main planet that you certainly focus on, and also you have obviously Saturn, Neptune, and Uranus. So they're the four major planets, and depending where they are, Inigo Jones made a forecast before his death in '53. He said there'd be certainly severe drought conditions in the early '80s, and he based that forecast on the fact that the planets all lined up in front of the sun. So therefore, there was no gravitational pull in relation to the planets on the sun causing sunspot activity. So he was able to make that forecast. So these are the things, the integral things you start to get into with the planet formations and where they are in the quadrants around the sun, and that's how you make your forecast. Does that make sense?
Okay, look, thanks for your time tonight. It's been greatly appreciated. I'll just wrap the show up now and introduce next week's guest. But if you can just stay on the line for a minute, we'll just have a little chat after.
Been a pleasure, Bill. Thank you very much.
Right. Oh, look, thanks very much for your time. It's been greatly appreciated. If you enjoyed tonight's show, please like, subscribe, and follow us on Facebook, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Next week's guest will be Professor James Allen, a law professor in constitutional law, and we'll be talking about separation of powers between the states and the Commonwealth and how it's been blurred since Federation. And it's been most obvious in this pandemic period, especially with the National Cabinet and the circumstances that came out of that. So please join us next week with Professor James Allen. Thank you.